We get asked all the time, are there more injuries this year than last year? And while the overall difference isn't some huge amount, I can say this: the amount of high-profile players and quarterbacks are through the roof. The season's not even over yet, and we've already lost the likes of Joe Burrow, Kirk Cousins, Daniel Jones, Kenny Pickett, Anthony Richardson, Aaron Rodgers, Deshaun Watson, and then last night we watched Trevor Lawrence get injured and really unclear whether or not he's coming back or not anytime soon. There's going to be a few fantasy football playoff teams out there rocking the likes of Jake Browning and Joe Flacco, and that's damn crazy. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing well out there into week 14 of the fantasy football season, and today we're trying to figure out what quarterbacks can we start and sit here this week. But before we do, I got a question. How many of you out there, I'm looking way in the back too, how many of you out there have already hung up your outside Christmas lights? Now, I don't know about you, but I kind of set a solid line of over under 4 F-bombs whenever Christmas lights are going up. Sometimes I feel like I need to be an electrical engineer just to get my lights all hung up. Man, those adult beverages go down so much easier when you're working outside, especially when it's cold and you don't have to worry about anything getting warm. Now, if that's you as well and you kind of overdo it, don't worry, remember we have you covered. And you better believe I'm talking about Waterboy. Remember, we found something with 0 sugar, 0 caffeine, only 10 calories, and 3 times the electrolytes as their main competitor. It's gonna help rehydrate you, and there's a boost of vitamins in here that's gonna knock out some of that next day fatigue. Now, Waterboy is something super simple to use. You got these little packets. People pour little packets in their water all the time. We got different flavors. We got grape. We got strawberry lemonade. We got blue raspberry. All you need to do is head over to waterboy.com/headliners and get yourself hooked up right now with 15% off. Now, maybe you don't need this, but maybe you know someone who does. If only Christmas wasn't right around the corner. So if you know of somebody that needs a little bit of extra rehydration, Waterboy is for you. Once again, head over to waterboy.com/headliners and get yourself 15% off. There's links down below in the description. But now it's time to talk some football, and we're heading into Thursday night with a matchup between the Patriots and the Pittsburgh Steelers. But do me a favor here real quick, close your eyes and just picture this. You've worked all year long to try to get your team in a spot to make the fantasy playoffs. Then you make it all the way to week 14, a must-win week. Do you really want to start Bailey Zappi or Mitchell Trubisky? I really don't think you do. They both got a chance last week against some of the worst defenses against opposing quarterbacks in the NFL, and neither one of them exceeded 7 fantasy points. Both of them have solid defenses against opposing quarterbacks. Both have super low floors, both have super low ceilings, and neither one of these guys should be a fantasy option for you in week 14, especially in a Thursday night football game. I don't even know if I'm going to watch this game, if I'm being completely honest. No part of me wants to watch this matchup. It may get ugly. So let's not really waste any more time there on that Thursday night game. Let's go ahead and cabbage patch it over into some Sunday football, where we got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Atlanta Falcons up first. And for Tampa, we got the Bake Show, Baker Mayfield. And really, not a whole lot has really changed over the last couple of weeks with Baker Mayfield. If anything, he's kind of struggled 2 of his last 3 games, but more so due to difficult matchups against San Francisco and Carolina. Both of those teams allow bottom 5 points to opposing quarterbacks here in fantasy football. They're not easy matchups, but more often than not, Baker just needs touchdowns, a lot of them. He's only thrown for over 300 yards 1 time all year long and has almost as many turnovers as touchdowns here in 2023. We kind of just got to be a little bit selective if we're putting Baker Mayfield into our lineups. We need good matchups. For whatever reason, he can't seem to get Chris Godwin the football, so his ceiling is limited because it's basically just him and Mike Evans. I know the Mike Evans owners aren't complaining about it, but when it comes to a quarterback, doesn't give him the highest ceiling. Now he has a matchup going up against Atlanta. They allow the 11th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks at 17.7 points per game. These two teams also played each other earlier in the year. In that game, Baker had 275 yards passing, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, and 32 yards rushing. He was the quarterback 11 overall on the week. And right now, Atlanta's top defensive back, A.J. Terrell, is currently in concussion protocol. So that's definitely something to pay attention to. When it comes to injuries in Tampa Bay, the offense is fairly healthy. The defense, on the other hand, not so healthy. With all the injuries and 2 fantasy viable quarterbacks on a bye week here this week in Sam Howell and Kyler Murray, I don't hate Baker Mayfield as a fill-in option. I also don't love it either. The ceiling and the floor, there isn't a huge difference between them. I kind of view Baker Mayfield more as a top 15 option than a top 12 option here in week 14. What about his opponent in Desmond Ridder? I don't know if I feel the same way about Desmond Ridder. I mean, I kind of should though, right? This is a great matchup for him. But like I said, this Bucs defense is banged up. I just have trust issues, and they're all surrounding Arthur Smith. The Atlanta passing game sucks, but they excel on the ground, right? We know that all year long. Well, Tampa Bay's passing defense is what really sucks, but they're one of the top 10 run defenses in the NFL. Is Arthur Smith smart enough to attack Tampa Bay through the air and attack its injured secondary? The dude isn't even buff and doesn't even realize that his shirts are too small. I don't know if I have faith in him figuring out this offense. Because Tampa Bay allows 18.6 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, 7th most in the NFL, and they've had games recently against Will Levis and Bryce Young. So let's just be honest. They allow over 19 fantasy points per game because neither one of those quarterbacks helped out the average. They're fairly healthy on offense there in Atlanta, but we just haven't seen it enough to trust it in fantasy football. It's still a team with minimum receiving threats that has underproduced all year long. When I look at Desmond Ridder, a little bit more of a top 20 option and maybe a guy I look at for some underdog pick'ems if his lines come in really low here in week 14, but not somebody I want to put in my redraft fantasy football lineup if I don't have to. All right, let's go down to Baltimore now. For the Rams and the Ravens, we'll kick it off with Matthew Stafford. And how weird is this overall Rams offense, right? They struggled most of the year to really put it all together. Then Puka and Kupp, they get banged up, but Kyren Williams returns, and all of a sudden this offense gets hot. Coming into week 12, the Rams had only had 1 game all year long in which they scored 30 points. Now in back-to-back weeks, they've done just that. And the same can be said for Matthew Stafford and throwing some touchdowns, right? 1 game in the first 12 weeks of the season where he threw multiple touchdowns. He now has 7 touchdowns over the last 2 weeks, and one of those games came against one of the best defenses in the NFL, the Cleveland Browns. Now another tough matchup though going up against Baltimore. They allow only 12.7 fantasy points per game. That is fewest in the NFL. Both Tyler Higbee and Puka Nacua, they were banged up in week 13. However, reports are already coming out that they are not expected to miss any time. I don't want to take anything away from how well the Rams are playing over the last 2 weeks of the season, but going to Baltimore, with Baltimore coming off their bye week, having an extra week to prep for this game, a team that already allows the second fewest yards per game to opponents and the fewest points allowed all year long, there is just so much risk here this week for Matthew Stafford. Kind of look at him as more of a top 20 overall play. On the other side, we got Lamar Jackson. And coming off the bye week, I hope Lamar can go on a late season run here for everyone heading into their fantasy playoffs. Usually this time of year, Lamar Jackson is already hurt, so I'm really anxious to see what he can do down the stretch. He's the current quarterback 10 overall in fantasy football, but he's been a little bit more safe than ceiling over the last 5 games he's played. He's only managed to score over 15 fantasy points 1 time since week 8. Now, I'm sure the bye week kind of helped the Ravens get some of those nagging injuries healed, but you got to remember this is still an offense that's going to be without Mark Andrews. And even though we've seen some big days from Odell Beckham and Zay Flowers, when a quarterback like Lamar Jackson loses his binky like Mark Andrews, you have to think that the ceiling's going to come down. We have a little bit of a silver lining though, and potentially it's Isaiah Likely. We've seen him produce in this offense before, and we really need him to step up into that Mark Andrews role now. And this really isn't a horrible matchup for Lamar either. The Rams allow 17.7 fantasy points per game. That is tied for 11th most in the league. Plus, we know as of right now, when you look on the injury report overall, they look fairly healthy. While we can't really see a reason to put Lamar all the way back up inside the top 5 or 6 quarterbacks, there's really no reason why he still shouldn't be inside the top 12. We just saw Joe Flacco basically go from unemployed to throwing 2 touchdowns against the Rams last week. There's no reason why we can't see Lamar duplicate that kind of production. Which will then take us out to Chicago for the Bears and the Lions. And for Jared Goff, the longer the season goes on, the more I kind of get Kirk Cousins vibes from Jared Goff, right? He's not going to win you very many weeks, but he's super safe, and you really know what to expect from him weekly. He's averaging right around 18 fantasy points per game, consistently hovering right around the top 12 quarterbacks each and every week, and he has multiple touchdowns now in 8 of the 12 games he's played this season. Plus, he's thrown for 2 touchdowns in each of his last 4 games played. We know the running game is great in Detroit, and that's taking some of the pressure off of Jared Goff. It's also limiting some of his ceiling, but that offensive line is playing really good. Goff has only been sacked 6 times over the last 5 games played, and he's really just continues to be a safe weekly option. Now matchup going up against Chicago. They allow 17.3 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but remember, these two just faced off a couple of weeks ago. In that game, Jared Goff had 236 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions, finished as the quarterback 16. His worst game over the last month of the season. Now, there's no new injuries here in Detroit, and we have to pay attention to the fact that this is a road game. No, Jared Goff doesn't just suck on the road, but he is much better at home. But it's time that we start giving this Bears defense a little bit more credit than a lot of people are giving them. They are way improved, and they've forced 8 turnovers over their last 2 games played. With the offense that Jared Goff has, though, and the consistent production, he's going to be hovering right around quarterback 11 to 14 once again this week, just like he is every other week of the season. Now, on the other side of the football, you have to think that Justin Fields is looking forward to this rematch. In their Week 11 game, Justin Fields ended up as the quarterback 8 overall and ran for over 100 yards in that ball game. Now he gets to face them back at home in Chicago, and they just had their bye week, an extra week to prep for this matchup. I kind of like what we've been doing with Justin Fields since they brought him back from injury as well. A bunch of short passes, gain some confidence, run when you're pressured. Now, it hasn't really resulted in a lot of touchdowns here as of yet, but that's where the rushing upside comes into play. He has 30 carries over his last 2 games combined. Now a matchup going up against Detroit. They allow 18.8 fantasy points per game, 5th most in the NFL. If we can get Justin Fields anywhere near 25 pass attempts and 13 carries on the ground, we're looking at another top 12 week. He's been right around those numbers each and every game since coming back from injury, so there's really no reason to believe he's not going to be in the same area there once again. When my rankings come out here for week 14, Justin Fields going to be inside the top 12. Which will now take us out to Cincinnati for the Bengals and the Colts. And did anyone else out there see Gardner Minshew celebrating in the locker room after week 13 and that overtime win? Just head banging, just hair flowing everywhere. I mean, I do kind of wonder what that feels like. Anyway, it was a great top 12 overall week for Gardner Minshew in week 13. He needed overtime to get that additional production, but hey, fantasy points are fantasy points. It was his first game since the week of Halloween with multiple touchdowns in a game. And that's really what's been keeping him from being a fantasy viable option for us here this year, especially for those of you in 2 quarterback leagues. He only has 3 games all year with multiple touchdowns despite some pretty good matchups here throughout the season. Now a matchup going up against Cincinnati, though. They allow 18.8 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That's tied for 5th most in the NFL. But maybe that number even could have been a little bit higher had we had Trevor Lawrence for the remainder of that game on Monday night and not C.J. Beathard. But back to the Colts. There is an injury that we're paying attention to. It's offensive tackle Braden Smith, currently questionable with a knee injury. Would love to have him available here in week 14. We said in this show just last week that we were hoping due to the Jonathan Taylor injury, they would throw the ball a little bit more in Indianapolis. Well, that's what they did in week 13, so let's hope that continues. If we can get Gardner Minshew throwing the ball 40 plus times a game, he could definitely be a fantasy viable option, especially as quick as starting quarterbacks are falling. Now, he may not be some top 12 guy, but I do like him over guys like Matthew Stafford and Baker Mayfield. But what about Jake Browning? I mean, is this kid legit, or was the matchup just that good? I mean, going up against Jacksonville last week, they allow some of the most points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but Jake Browning played great football overall. He completed 86% of his passes, 350 plus yards passing, 2 total touchdowns, finished as the quarterback 4 overall on the week in week 13. But when you have awesome weapons like Jamar Chase and T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd and Joe Mixon, multiple young tight end options, they're going to give you a chance weekly to have a solid fantasy day. But we can't look at Jake Browning as some auto must start each and every week. We also can't discount him either. He really could be an option for us here rest of season in good matchups, but I'm not trying to get too cocky with Jake Browning and throwing him out there against anyone and everyone. But he may be one of the better backup quarterbacks that we see playing right now in the NFL. In this matchup this week, got a matchup going up against Indianapolis. They allow 15.2 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That's 9th fewest in the NFL, but 3 of their last 4 games have been against the likes of the Panthers, the Patriots, and the Titans. Not exactly murderer's row of wide receivers and passing games right there. Now, before I recorded this section, I took a look at the consensus rankings to see what they thought about Jake Browning. They currently have him at quarterback 19, and personally, that's too low for me. He's going to be a little bit higher. He may actually squeak up inside my top 15 at the quarterback position, but really, if you've watched this kid play and you don't like what you see, I do question your ability to break down players because he is a solid young quarterback in an offense that he can definitely manage with high-profile weapons. This kid could be something down the stretch if needed. Which will then take us out to Cleveland for the Browns and the Jacksonville Jaguars. We got to talk about Trevor Lawrence right here at the top because I could almost feel the collective clinch of every Trevor Lawrence fantasy owner's sphincter when he went down on Monday night. The kid had just started to turn it on here this season, proving that he was capable of what so many people expected from him this year. He'd had 3 straight games of 25 fantasy points or more, but now all eyes are on the injury he suffered in week 13. It's being called a high ankle sprain, and as of right now, he has not been ruled out for week 14. Do not expect him to practice much, if at all, this week, and if I had to guess, we don't hear anything for days whether or not he's going to play or not unless things don't progress at all, especially since this is a very tough matchup going up against Cleveland. They allow only 13.4 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, one of the best defenses in the NFL. Plus, this offense also lost Christian Kirk to a core muscle injury, and he's expected to miss some quote-unquote time. I gotta be real with you though, if you own Trevor Lawrence in fantasy football, you need another backup plan right now. I don't care if it's someone like Jake Browning, who we just talked about, Gardner Minshew, Baker Mayfield. Hell, even this week, even damn Joe Flacco I would put on my bench just in case. Personally, I would be shocked if Trevor Lawrence played football here this week, but I also know that division is super close still and they can't afford to lose any more ball games. But you gotta have a backup plan. You gotta find something here just in case these are must-win weeks. I don't want to wait until the weekend to find out we don't have Trevor Lawrence, and then you have no options available. All right, on the other side of the football, could be one of those options. I hope it's not, but it could be in Joe Flacco. I mean, is he still good? I mean, last week he threw for 254 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception against the Rams after basically being damn unemployed most of the season. Now he gets a matchup going up against Jacksonville, and that defense can't stop the pass for nothing. Let's not sit here, though, and act like it's 2014 and Joe Flacco is some top play at the quarterback position, because he's not. But as a streaming option for just this 1 week, I guess I don't hate it, especially in 2 quarterback leagues. Now, for your sake, like I said, I hope you have better options, but there are worse options out there. In a matchup going up against Jacksonville, they allow 19.9 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That is 3rd most in the NFL, and they are much harder to run on than they are to throw on. Another injury to pay attention to in Cleveland is Amari Cooper, though. He suffered a concussion, currently in the concussion protocol. We need to see if he gets cleared in time to play in week 14. Now, we also know that Joe Flacco, he's not going to offer anything on the ground with his legs. Dude isn't mobile, so we need touchdowns. We need multiple touchdowns. Could he go out here this week against this defense in Jacksonville and put up 225 yards passing, 2 touchdowns and 1 interception? Sure, he can, and that would put him right in the neighborhood of quarterback 15 to 20 or so, which is probably where he's going to fall in my rankings. Which will then take us out to New Orleans for the Saints and the Panthers, and not a whole lot to talk about in this matchup if I'm being completely honest. The coaches can change in Carolina, but the bad play gonna continue. Another game of Bryce Young with 0 touchdowns. He's now had that in 3 of the last 4 games he's played. Carolina, as a team, has only scored over 18 points in a game 2 times all year long. Bryce hasn't gotten any better. The offensive line is an absolute disaster, and now they barely even target their best wide receiver, Adam Thielen, anymore. We're going into week 14 of the season. Bryce Young has a total of 9 touchdowns. That alone is enough to avoid him in fantasy football, much less a matchup on the road in New Orleans, and they allow under 16 fantasy points per game, not starting Bryce Young. How about anybody in New Orleans? Honestly, is it Derek Carr? Is it Jameis Winston? Right now, we really don't know. Derek Carr suffered yet another shoulder injury in week 13 and was concussed. New Orleans then chose to go heavy Taysom on the ground instead of going full Jameis through the air. The team ran the ball 36 times, only threw it 29 times. The last thing I want in my fantasy lineup is a quarterback carousel weekly, especially in a tough matchup going up against Carolina. They allow only 13.1 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That is second fewest in the league. Plus, we still know that Rashid Shaheed, another offensive weapon here in New Orleans, is still hurt. There's only one quarterback I'm considering in New Orleans, and that's Taysom Hill as a tight end. If you can throw him in that tight end spot, I'm doing it and I'm locking it in. If you can't, I'm not even considering Derek Carr or Jameis Winston at this point in New Orleans. Which now brings us to a matchup of the Houston Texans, New York Jets, and we'll kick it off with CJ Stroud. Imagine what I just said about Bryce Young. Now imagine saying that same thing about CJ Stroud. You just wouldn't. But there are a ton of similarities. Both are rookie quarterbacks, we know that. Both franchises had new coaches to start the season. Both teams have bad offensive lines. And both teams have super similar weapons. Just think about this. Nico Collins, Adam Thielen. Tank Dell, a rookie. We had Jonathan Mingo there in Carolina. How about Noah Brown? Kind of somebody who was a little bit of a surprise, a little bit more boomer bust in Houston. We got DJ Chark in Carolina. How about Devin Singletary? Well, we got Chuba Hubbard. And then Dameon Pierce, an underperforming running back. Yeah, we got one of those too in Miles Sanders in Carolina. That just shows you, though, how pro-ready CJ Stroud was and still is. He's the current quarterback 5 overall in fantasy football, averaging over 20 fantasy points per game, and has scored over 16 fantasy points now in 5 straight ball games. Not an easy matchup this week, though, going up against the Jets. They allow only 14.2 fantasy points per game, 6th fewest in the NFL. But we also can't ignore the fact that Tank Dell is probably now done for the season. On a stupid play call. What is Tank Dell? One of the smallest players on your entire roster. What is he in the mix on a goal line carry for anyway? That makes no sense. Get him out of there. Sure, they scored a touchdown on that play, but it wasn't because of Tank Dell, and now you've lost one of your best offensive weapons for no apparent reason. We also know that Dalton Schultz, he's still currently questionable as well. Hopefully he can return pretty soon, but let's not look at this matchup and think it's some cakewalk for CJ Stroud. Because it's really not. Losing Tank Dell is going to be a big part of this offense. Now is the time, once again, for Noah Brown to step up and put up some big numbers. And like I just mentioned, hopefully we get Dalton Schultz back soon as well. Can't also really ignore the fact that Nico Collins probably going to see a whole lot of sauce this weekend as well. I'm probably going to have CJ Stroud still as a top 12 quarterback, but more in that 10 to 12 range here this week. Now, on the other side of the football, not a chance in hell that I consider any quarterback for the New York Jets. They just released Tim Boyle. They say they want Zach Wilson to take it back over. Zach Wilson doesn't want to take it back over, but head coach Robert Saleh says that Zach wants to take it over. It's like a damn Jerry Springer episode there for the Jets. I don't care about how good the matchup is going up against Houston. I don't want to start a quarterback on one of the lowest scoring teams in the NFL. There are way too many other better options out there for me this week. No one in the Jets is doing anything for the eggplant meter here in week 14. Which now takes us out to Vegas for the Raiders and the Minnesota Vikings. And for Josh Dobbs, welcome back off the bye week, and congrats on adding back in arguably the best wide receiver in football in Justin Jefferson. What a way to bounce back from a bad game before the bye, right? Especially given the fact that these are must-win games for Minnesota. Josh Dobbs has an opportunity to put up some good fantasy numbers. Right now, averaging 17.2 fantasy points per game, the current quarterback 15 overall, and has scored over 17 fantasy points in 3 of the 4 games he's played in Minnesota. Now, sure, he looked horrible just before the bye week, and I don't know if you remember that game or not, but there was a play early on in that ballgame where I believe he may have suffered a concussion. He wasn't brought off the field, he wasn't checked, but ever since that play, he just seemed off. But that's just my opinion, just something I observed during that ball game. But now they have a matchup this week going up against the Las Vegas Raiders. They allow 15.8 fantasy points per game. That is 11th fewest in the league. But we know this Minnesota team is fresh off the bye, and they should be close to fully healthy. Dobbs was scoring points in this offense without Justin Jefferson. Now you're going to add him back into this lineup, coming off the bye week where they had an extra week to prep for this matchup. Josh Dobbs is going to be a Verge top 12 quarterback for me here in week 14. What about Aiden O'Connell? Don't quite feel the same way about Aiden O'Connell. We've seen him now for multiple weeks in this offense, and I will say he's not playing bad. He's just not really showing any potential ceiling in this offense despite having Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers each and every week. His season high in a game is 13.9 fantasy points per game, and that was just 2 weeks ago, the game prior to their bye week. I mean, really, he's basically a guy that's going to go out each and every week, throw right around 225 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 turnover more than likely, and be a top 24 option. Now he gets a matchup this week going up against Minnesota. They allow 16.5 fantasy points per game, right around league average. Another team, though, coming off the bye week, they should be fairly healthy. No disrespect to the young super trooper here. He just does not have a high enough ceiling to consider as a fantasy viable option here in week 14. Which will now take us down to an NFC matchup here, the San Francisco 49ers, Seattle Seahawks. And for Geno Smith, he had himself a damn Will Ferrell moment from the movie Old School. Dude just blacked out and played out of his mind in week 13. No one coming into that game after seeing him play all season long in an upcoming matchup against the Dallas Cowboys would have thought, Geno's going to go out there here this week, throw for 334 yards, 3 touchdowns, an interception, and have a rushing touchdown and be the overall quarterback one. But I'll be damned if that did not happen just last week. No way that happens again, though, right? Not against this San Francisco team. San Francisco only allows 14 fantasy points per contest to opposing quarterbacks, and these two teams just faced off a couple weeks ago. In that matchup, Geno was quarterback 29 overall in the week, had 180 yards passing, no touchdowns, and 1 interception. But we have to bring up how banged up this running game is in Seattle. We know Kenneth Walker has been injured, he's missed multiple games, and he's still questionable to play this week. But now, Zach Charbonnet is also banged up and questionable to play after suffering a knee injury just last week. You have to think that because of that, Seattle is going to have to throw the ball a lot more. And San Francisco is easier to throw on than they are to run on. But the amount of risk in starting Geno Smith this week against this San Francisco defense is going to be huge. San Francisco hasn't allowed an opponent to score over 19 points in a game since the week of Halloween, and Geno Smith isn't Jalen Hurts. When I look at Geno here this week in week 14, I kind of see a top 20 option. How about Brock Purdy? This kid needs to be in the conversation for MVP of the league. Maybe not the front runner, maybe he shouldn't win it, but this dude needs more damn respect for how good he's playing. Over the last month of the season, he's completing over 75% of his passes, averaging over 288 yards passing a game, and has 11 total touchdowns in 4 games. He's the current quarterback 7 overall in fantasy and averaging just under 20 fantasy points per game. Now a matchup going up against Seattle, they allow 17.4 fantasy points per game, but it's worth noting that the worst game that Brock Purdy has had over the last month of the season came against these Seattle Seahawks a couple weeks ago, where he only had 209 yards passing, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. Overall, though, this offense is healthy, which means what? Yes, I have said it all year long. As long as CMC, Debo, Brandon Ayuk, and George Kittle are all healthy, Brock Purdy needs to be in your fantasy lineup. Which will then bring us out to Kansas City for a matchup of the Chiefs and the Bills, my Manscaped matchup of the week. And I can't stress this enough. Christmas is right around the corner. It will be here before you know it. But I know I'm not the only person in Headliner Nation that procrastinates on buying Christmas gifts. As soon as this video is over, you need to head over to manscaped.com and get some of that Christmas shopping taken care of. The laughs you can share on a Christmas morning with a family member opening up something from Manscaped is something that you may never forget. And maybe you're a little bit more reserved. You don't gotta get ball hair trimmers. You can find deodorant, body wash, shampoo, lip balm, even boxer briefs. Whatever you do though, don't pay full price. Use the referral code HEADLINERS at checkout for 20% off and free shipping. Links down below in the description. But just like Manscaped is a no-brainer for Christmas presents, this matchup right here is a no-brainer in fantasy football. Josh Allen, the current quarterback, 1 overall. Mahomes, the current quarterback, 8 overall. Now, obviously, I feel at this point of the year, a lot more people are more happy with Josh Allen than they have been with Patrick Mahomes. Now, even though it's a down year for Patrick Mahomes, he's still averaging right around 19 fantasy points per game. And plus, when these two get together, points are typically scored. There hasn't been a game in which these two played each other in which they both didn't have at least 2 touchdowns in every game. Both offenses are overall fairly healthy. Both of these defenses are a lot easier to run on than they are to throw on, but both defenses are also top 5 in the NFL in allowing the least amount of points to their opponents. Sounds like a 2023 recipe for a whole lot of offense. And no, I'm not confused. I didn't get that backwards. It just seems like in 2023, whenever you think you know what's going to happen, the absolute opposite does. I'm going to trust history a little bit more and expect a little bit more scoring in this game than maybe what a lot of people think. You know, both of these teams want to walk away with a win in this matchup. It's going to be fun to watch. Which will then take us out to LA for the Chargers and the Broncos. We'll kick it off with Mr. Unlimited Russell Wilson, because as of right now, he's out there playing the old reliable role almost each and every week, scoring 16 plus fantasy points in 5 of his last 6 games played. But over the last 2 weeks of the season, it's a lot of thanks to the rushing upside. Over his last 2 games, he's had 21 rush attempts, 78 rushing yards, and 2 rushing tutties. That's the best back-to-back performance that he's had in the run game all year long. Really, one of the most worrisome things here for me is if the rushing upside isn't there, the passing game hasn't really been enough to make him fantasy startable. He's thrown for less than 200 yards passing now in 7 of his last 8 games. But what's weird is the passing game doesn't suck. They just don't choose to utilize it until late in the game almost every single week. But now they get a matchup going up against the Chargers. They allow over 19 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, which is 4th most in the NFL. No new major injuries here on offense, and we've seen a lot of quarterbacks find success against this Chargers team all year long. So honestly, with all the bye weeks, with all the injuries, I do feel like Russell Wilson has a chance to be a top 12 play here in week 14. On the other side of the football, we got I'm just going to say Justin Herbert, because right now he ain't making a lot of people feel very fancy. A lot of people are hitting the panic button on Justin Herbert. Back-to-back games now, under 15 fantasy points at the worst time of the year. I know it. Justin Herbert had only gone under 15 fantasy points 2 times all season long, through 12 weeks. Now he's done it in back-to-back games. But it's not all on Justin Herbert. The dude needs some healthy weapons. I think that's obvious to see. But let's also acknowledge the fact that his last 2 matchups haven't exactly been easy either. Baltimore and New England, it's not like he was going out there and sucking against a bunch of scrub defenses. Baltimore is one of the best in the league, and even though New England sucks as an overall team, their defense is still pretty solid. Now, for the most part, speaking of being solid, Justin Herbert has been just that most of the year. But is this matchup really much better? Going up against Denver, they've played a lot better the second half of the season. Now, they're also allowing 18 fantasy points per game, and we just saw CJ Stroud last week score 16 fantasy points against this defense. So it's not like there's some defensive juggernaut that just doesn't allow anything. But it also doesn't sound like we're really any closer to getting Josh Palmer back in this offense as well. We're still waiting to find out if and when he may return. I think we need to live with the fact that Justin Herbert is more of a top 12 option than a top 5 option at this point of the season. But can I just throw out there that Brandon Staley doesn't really do a whole lot for me. I don't feel like he puts this team in a great position to win ball games. He doesn't seem like the type of coach that a lot of players get amped up and rally behind. If I had to guess, his seat's about as hot as it gets, and for Justin Herbert, he's on the verge of falling outside the top 12, but will make it barely inside of it here in week 14. Which brings us to Sunday Night Football, the Philadelphia Eagles and the Dallas Cowboys. This could be the Manscaped matchup part 2, because really this is a no-brainer matchup when it comes to fantasy football once again. No teams vying for the fantasy football playoffs right now are sitting Dak Prescott or Jalen Hurts. They're the current quarterback 2 and 3 overall on the season, and matchups be damned, these two guys go out weekly and put up numbers. They faced off back in week 9. In that ballgame, Dak scored 28 fantasy points, Jalen Hurts 25. It's really matchups like this that you cannot overthink in fantasy football. Sure, some pretty solid defenses on both sides, but when you have two quarterbacks who average over 21 fantasy points per game, you leave them in your lineup regardless of the matchup, especially in a matchup that both of these guys have proven to produce in before. Really, the only other thing I'm going to add to this, because we know they're two must-start guys, I'm just glad the game is being played indoors so we don't have to worry about any weather. But don't look now, we have two Monday Night Football games here in Week 14. The first one, the Tennessee Titans and Miami Dolphins. For Tennessee and Will Levis, it's not that point of the fantasy football season where we're really considering starting Will Levis. He has 7 touchdowns through 6 games, and 4 of them came in that very first game he played. Just not a passing offense that scores a lot of points first off, but secondly, they really only have one top wide receiver option, and you better believe that DeAndre Hopkins is going to be covered by Jalen Ramsey in this ball game. Miami also has a top 10 defense against the pass and the rush. A lot of people think of Miami and they think offense, but this defense isn't bad at all. Not a time to start Will Levis. As for Tua, perfect time to start Tua here this week. The current quarterback 11 overall in fantasy football, averaging 18.4 fantasy points per game. He scored over 18 fantasy points now in 2 of his last 3 ball games, and Tennessee just gave up a top 12 overall quarterback week to Gardner Minshew last week. I like my chances with Tua. Similar to what I said about Brock Purdy earlier in the show. When the offense of the Miami Dolphins is fully healthy, just stop overthinking it and put them in your lineup. The risk of sitting them is way too great because they all have matchup winning type of upside. Plus, as the cherry on top in this matchup, the game's being played at home in Miami, and Tua thrives at home. Which then leads us to our last game of the week, the Green Bay Packers at the New York Giants. And for Jordan Love, it's about damn time that people are starting to realize how good this kid is. The current quarterback 9 overall in fantasy football through 13 weeks is absolutely crazy. It's time that this kid gets some love. No pun intended, but 4 straight games now with over 18 fantasy points scored. And over those 4 games, he has 10 total touchdowns. With this running game still banged up and hurting, you know that he has to throw the ball weekly. When you have guys like Romeo Doubs, Jaden Reed, Christian Watson, Dontavian Wicks, touchdowns are more likely to come pretty frequently. But now, all of a sudden, once again, another Christian Watson injury. I know, it's a shocker. But can I have a side tangent here for a second? I've seen a lot of people over the last 2 weeks saying that Christian Watson is a league winner. If you hear that, I mean, maybe you won't now because he's hurt again, but those are the types of things you need to question when getting your fantasy football content. The guy was a 5th round pick. A lot of people had huge expectations for him coming into the season. He then underproduced and killed your fantasy team for 11 weeks. And then after like 2 good games, all of a sudden, dude is a league winner and they've completely forgotten how he tanked your team to start the season. Even if he's healthy, he's not a league winner. He's basically doing what he should have been doing most of the season. All right, tangent over now. In this matchup, they're going up against the Giants. They allow 16.1 fantasy points per game. We know Aaron Jones also questionable to play in this contest, and we're waiting to hear about Christian Watson to see how much time he's going to miss with a hamstring injury. It's not like the loss of Christian Watson, though, is an absolute killer to Jordan Love. He hasn't been used to him being on the field majority of the season. Sure, maybe it takes a little bit off the top, right? Maybe the ceiling is a little bit lower, but the floor for Jordan Love is still super safe. I wish Christian Watson could stay healthy. I would love to see what that kid could do if he played 16, 17 games in the season, but it is what it is at this point. And in this matchup, Love, he's still going to be a top 12 option for me this week. All right, and then finally, Tommy DeVito. I would love to hop on the Tommy DeVito bandwagon. I really would like to do it. I just can't. I'm sorry. The kid has heart, and truly, he's better than I had expected him to be. But I'm not trusting him on taking me into the fantasy playoffs in a game going up against Green Bay, who allows the 8th fewest points to opposing quarterbacks. Add in the fact that this is going to be a primetime football game. I'm rooting for the kid, but he's not fantasy trustworthy at this point. All right, that's going to do it for my quarterback start and sit video here for week 14 of fantasy football. Hopefully I was able to give you a little bit of information to make those lineup decisions a little bit easier. Just a reminder, maybe you're trying to decide between two quarterbacks. Our rankings videos come out on Thursday prior to Thursday Night Football. So if you have any last minute questions, they'll be able to be answered then. But I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you guys enjoy the rest of your day. And then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
I'm a headliner.